Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Stephen Allen, and I'm a member of the Indigenous Solidarity Working Group. Thank you for being here on this marvelous June afternoon. If you have never been inside Redeemer, a warm welcome and an important message that the washrooms are near the main door on my right-hand side. Just a quick overview of the flow of the afternoon. Paige Suter will be sitting here, and Douglas Sanderson will be there, and from New York, Andrew Stolo-Steinerman, and she has questions for them, a conversation, and when that time comes to an end, this will be your opportunity, whether you're here in Redeemer or whether you were joining us from some corner of the planet, either on Zoom or on YouTube. And the questions will be monitored and given to Paige, who is our host and interviewer. And at the end of our time, we will gather at the back of the church for coffee, tea, and homemade cookies. So again, a warm welcome to everyone. We will now ask Sandra Campbell, who will begin our afternoon with a smudge and a prayer. And Sandra is a member of Church of the Redeemer, and she is the outreach coordinator with the Toronto Urban Native Ministry. Sandra.
Sego, I come from Ganangawati, Wakta, Mohawk First Nation, and I'm from the Wolf Clan. So I'm going to be very brief, because I'm sure we like to hear our guest speaker. So I'll start off with the smudge. We welcome the eastern direction, the direction where the sun rises and new beginnings start. And if there's certain things I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of that, I'll acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich and Nawagoa. I like to acknowledge that southern direction, the direction of sunshine, and where our youth sit, where there's a lot of energy and a lot of growth happening. And this is where we lean into our spirituality and into our lives. And if there's certain things I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of, I'll acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich and Nawagoa. And then I like to acknowledge that western direction. The direction, there's no true words to describe this direction. It's the direction that we walk out of when we walk out into the spirit world. But it's also a direction where our adults sit, where they get to do harvesting. And so in the beginning when we planted things, and then when things are growing, we harvest it, we get our answers. And if there's certain things that I'm unaware of, or I've not mentioned, I'll acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich and Nawagoa. And then I like to acknowledge that northern direction, the direction of wintertime. This is a time when Mother Earth is sleeping, when the snow is on the ground. It's also a place where our elders sit, where we can present our tobacco ties to, so we can get some good direction in our lives, or general questions on how to raise our children, how to go, conduct ourselves in work. It's also a time where we, that direction where we come together in community and we share stories and songs and dance, and where we learn from each other. And if there's certain things I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware, I'll acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich and Nawagoa. And then I like to acknowledge our ancestors. These are the ones that worked real hard in their lives so that we could have this good life today. They could be a grandma, a grandpa, a mother, a father, auntie and uncle, or somebody that you hold in high esteem. And and if there's certain things I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of, I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich and Nawagoa. And then I like to acknowledge Mother Earth. She's always there, always providing unconditionally, providing us with all our clothing, all our food, and all our shelter. And as she loves us so much, we should be reminded to take good care of her too. And this is a time that, like you should recycle and reuse and so forth, and take care of the planet. And as we come into that center, and as we're invited into creation, where we meet our Creator, the Creator had known us before we were born, to say kind words and praises to each other as we are in community. If there's certain thing I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of, I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich, and now I'll go, Jimikwich, 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 aha. And now I'm going to invite Douglas, our host speaker, and Paige, and I'll fill some sage in my pot so I can smudge them, and then after that I'll be singing a song. Normally I have a helper, but she's in ceremony right now. For some reason, I'm compelled to sing the creation song. And I know it's going on YouTube, so there's no right or wrong way to do things, so if my pronunciation, don't hold it to me. But it is the creation song.
It's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator and our two speakers. Douglas Sanderson, who's here with us in person, also known by his spirit name of Amo Binashi, is Swampy Cree, Beaver Clan, Beaver Clan, I should have known that, of the Opisewak Cree Nation across Saskatchewan. The reserve is across the river from La Pas, Manitoba. So you know why he was so enthralled with doing this project that has resulted in this amazing book. Douglas is a frequent contributor to Policy Options and Global Brief, neither of which I read, and has served as a senior policy advisor to the Government of Ontario in the offices of the Attorney General and of Aboriginal Affairs, which of course Mr. Ford demolished. Douglas is the Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, my alma mater. He received the 2021 Ludwig and Estelle Juss Memorial Human Rights Prize for his lifetime of work in the field of human rights. Douglas is our first visiting Indigenous scholar, and we are proud to say so and to have him say yes. Andrew Stobo Snyderman, who's on the screen, is a writer, lawyer, and Rhodes Scholar from Montreal. He has reported, and done op-eds in major media in the UK and Canada. His profile of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools won the award for the best print feature of 2011 from the Canadian Association of Journalists, which explains some of the reason why the book is so beautifully written. Andrew has advocated for Indigenous clients as a lawyer and has also served in the Human Rights Policy Advisor for the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Andrew lives in New York and describes himself on LinkedIn as a historian. The two of them have been awarded the Distinguished Book Prize by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center for Great Plains Study. The book was a finalist for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing last year. The jury said about Birdtail, as Canada grapples with a difficult history of residential schools and discrimination against Indigenous peoples, Snyderman and Sanderson tell a moving story that educates and provides potential paths to reconciliation. Valley of the Birdtail not only elicits empathy, but also moves us to action, shedding a shining light on our individual responsibility to respect each other's humanity. This is a masterfully written and accessible book which will resonate well beyond Canada as we work towards policies that create a better future for all. Up front with Douglas is Redeemer's curate, Paige Suter, who has a background in urban planning, community development, and political science. The central feature of her work for the last 20 years was social justice, serving the most vulnerable people in society and caring for creation. In her spare time, she uses it well. I'm not going to say what because somebody might invite her to a volleyball game. She was campaign manager for FaithWorks, which is the Diocese of Toronto fundraising mechanism which supports TUNM and Sandra, and served on the Bishop's Care for Creation Committee and as chair of Faith and the Common Good. Paige lives in southeast Scarborough with her husband. They have 3 children. I welcome you. If you have a question on Zoom, please raise the right yellow hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. There we are. That almost sounded like a good morning response. Good morning, Andrew and Douglas. I have been looking forward to this conversation since I arrived here at Redeemer. And I know that many folks here and folks that are online have very much been looking forward to this conversation as well. So just before we get at it, just a quick outline for how we can expect our time today to unfold. So Andrew and Douglas and I will have a conversation, and really I'm just going to get out of the way and let them talk about this really, really important book. And then after about half an hour to 45 minutes, as the Great Spirit moves us, we will open the conversation more broadly. So think about the questions that you have. And for folks who are on Zoom, we'll make sure that your questions are you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions as well. Okay. When I first read this book, I had a range of emotions, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But to make sure that we all have a common understanding of the stories that are braided together, the stories of Wewisi-Kapo and Rosburn, the stories of Maureen and Troy and all of their relations, the story of the Government of Canada as an agent in this story. Douglas, could you give us an overview, as much as you want or as little as you'd like, about this story?
Yes, thank you so much for having us here today, and thank you for everyone who's attended in person, a Saturday in June, amazing, and everyone who's joined online, so thank you so much. So Valley of the Birdtail is, well, it's really just the history of Canada, but we tell it we tell that story in a unique way, and that is by focusing in on two families, one of whom is Indigenous and lives in the Wewisi-Kapo Indian Reserve, and the other are Ukrainian immigrants, and they live just across the river in a little town called Rosburn. And curiously enough, both the reserve and the town are founded more or less around the same time, within a couple of years from one another. And so this actually provides us an opportunity to, it's sort of a kind of thought experiment in reality, where we can say, well, what happens if we had two communities side by side, founded at the same time? And one community we supported through decent schools, through access to the economy, through cultural and other economic and social supports. And what if we just did the opposite in the other community? What would happen over 150 years? And that's the story that we tell in Valley of the Birdtail. It's a story of these two communities told through two families, one on reserve, one off of, one of whom suffers the inequalities, one family does, and the other that experiences what it is to have a government that supports them. But this is really, like Pam said earlier, my own community in Manitoba, Pasquiat Cree Nation, we're right across the river from the Pas. So we're set up in exactly the same way, and all across the country, we find the same situation, an Indian reserve right next to a little town. So although this is a story that's set very locally within Saskatchewan, dealing with two very particular communities and two very particular families, it really is the story of our nation. And we use that story to show how inequality arises between Indigenous and settler peoples, how we chose to have those inequalities present. And then towards the end, we talk a little bit about what it is we might do and what it would mean for us to live in a condition of equality side by side.
Thank you. That's a really good summary. We're going to go deeper, I'm sure. But before we do that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew and ask you the question, because you started this work much earlier with an article that was published. And so I wonder if you could spend some time talking to us about what was going on in your heart and mind that brought this story to you and made it a central part of the work that you wanted to do. Andrew,
I
can
just
you
lost the audio.
can you hear me now? Andrew, can you
I just the audio. Yes, I just lost you
can
for
you
the
hear me
last
now?
15 seconds. I can hear you now.
Okay, wonderful. So let me try that again.
I just the audio.
So the question I want to ask you is, why was this story so important to you? Story so important to you?
Thanks for that question. And just so everyone knows, I think there's about a 5-second delay. So hopefully that doesn't disturb people, and hopefully there's no echo back to me. So I also want to say thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and it looks like a totally beautiful space. And I was thinking that we would all do well to see the world through stained glass. It looks like a most beautiful place. So I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Just lost the visual. Great. So I think I got involved in this book maybe for the same reason that people are here today, which is that I was asking myself that most basic question, which is, what is my role in all of this as a non-Indigenous Canadian? And I, perhaps like many people in this room, I started learning about Canadian history, and it was horrifying. And I wanted to have some role in facing that history. And I wasn't quite sure how to do that. And I think Douglas and I have heard someone tell us a few months ago that Indigenous people need allies, not saviors. And I think in some way I've been thinking through that for these last years. And this book is kind of my attempt to try to answer that challenge to myself. And I think the narrow thing that got me interested in this book was this fact that in this country, all across this country, that many hundreds of thousands of Indigenous students were attending schools on reserve that were far lower quality. And they were funded at a dramatically lower rate. And it was leading to bad outcomes. It meant that they had underpaid teachers. It meant that the good teachers didn't stay. It meant that they didn't have school supplies. And it meant that they didn't have basic supports for their development. And that really upset me. And I was drawn to this particular story because it's the story about these two communities, as Douglas was saying, these two families, an Indigenous family and a non-Indigenous family, with these stark differences between their schools and between their communities. And I thought to myself, well, if we could try to see from the point of view of this town and from this reserve, we might learn something important about what it is to get to a place of inequality and what it might look like to try to address that. And I'll briefly say that I reached out to Douglas, in part because I knew him, he had been my law professor, but also because this is a project, well, and maybe this, not just this book, but this whole reconciliation project, it's a team effort. If it's gonna work, it's a team effort. And so the idea was to have both of our points of view enriching this story and enriching the proposals at the end. And I hope we've created something that resonates with Indigenous readers, with non-Indigenous readers, and we've found the right voice to capture in a meaningful way these two families and these two communities in such a way as to resonate well beyond that.
Thank you for that. I really do appreciate whoever it is that said to you, allies and not saviors. You could have started or focused this book on any number of things. You could have started with higher rates of incarceration, more interactions with the court system, higher rates of poverty and homelessness, higher rates of suicide and mental health challenges. And you started with education. And Andrew has talked about the ramifications of that. Douglas, can you paint us the picture of the disparities of the educational system from on reserve and non-reserve?
Sure. So, thank you. So I'm going to tell a little bit of Stobo's story now here while I relate to you some of these facts. So, the Constitution of Canada is a funny beast. And one of the weird things it does is it makes the federal government in charge of some stuff and the province is in charge of other stuff. So schools and education, that's totally a provincial responsibility. But Indians are a federal responsibility. So in a way, provinces don't think of Indians that live in the province as citizens of that province, because another level of government is responsible for them. And that's how we end up with a residential school system, right? Because we get two completely separate systems of schools. Now, after the residential schools closed in the 90s, Stobo discovered that the federal government was underfunding, in comparison to provincial school systems, reserve schools were receiving 35 to 40% less money per student. So in practice, and I think Stobo started to talk about this, what does that actually mean? Well, it means there's no access to technology in any of those schools. They don't have textbooks. They don't have supplies. They get the worst teachers, right? You get out of teaching college, you can't get a job anywhere in the city, you go to a reserve, you stay for a year maybe, you get some experience, and you leave. It means you get the worst administrators. And the results actually show. Indigenous students, very few of them are graduating. I think the quote that we use is that an Indigenous student has a better chance of landing in prison than they do of going to university, or graduating even. So what happens, and what got Stobo originally really interested in this, was one, just the idea that we're all wandering around apologizing for residential schools. We're all so sorry. We feel so bad. And while we're doing that, we are underfunding schools on reserves. And remember, these are all policy choices that we're making. There's no necessary reason for this. So then Stobo discovered that there was a community in Saskatchewan that had managed to convince the federal government to increase the funding for education for its reserve to a level that would meet the communities all around. And then they would join forces together in a unified school district. And so the result is that, of course, with more funding, the reserve school's able to hire good students or good teachers. In fact, people actually want to teach there. Children from the Rossburn schools, they attend some classes on the Wayway Reserve, which I think is the only place in Canada that it happens. And the reading levels begin to significantly improve because the classrooms are smaller and the teachers are better. And so that was the crux of the book at one point, and it was just about this idea that education is the most important thing. If we can just equalize education, we'll be good. Hands in the air, we're done. But at the same time, Stobo and I have both worked in politics, and we know that funding that's a discretionary decision. Those are decisions that governments can make, and Indigenous people are 5% of the population, so we're never going to swing an election, and that means we have no political voice. When you're in a provincial school system and the province cuts the funding, everyone notices right away and they rise up. But when you cut the funding on a reserve, no one even notices. So what that meant to us is that we had to think about if we wanted to worry about education, we were going to have to think about more than just education funding. We were going to have to think about how is it that we can get into a situation where we know Indigenous students are going to be properly funded. And the answer to that question, and we'll talk more about the details later, is you have to put the authority for funding, the ability to raise money and spend it, into the hands of Indigenous communities. Because the way we fix this education problem is, it turns out, fortunately, the same way we fix the access to justice problem, the clean, potable running water problem, the problem with child welfare. These are about governments, Indigenous governments, being able to make decisions and spend money on their citizens. And so education started as a way in. The injustice of it was so obvious to us. But the solution, it turned out, demanded a picture that was bigger than education alone.
One of the things that struck me in the book was as how carefully you you illuminated the government, the Crown, as an agent, an intentional agent of injustice and racism. And it wasn't just the overall institution, but it was the individual actors as well. And you talk a couple of times in the book, you note those individuals who stood at an ethical crossroad and said, no, this is not just, this is not right, and yet the system overtook. And so I wonder whether Andrew or Douglas, you want to speak, Andrew, if you want to speak to that reality that you're naming in the book, that the government is an intentional agent. Even those individuals who want to do the right thing couldn't. Those individuals who want to do the right thing couldn't.
Thank you for that question. And I don't know if everyone noticed, but Douglas was way more articulate than I was at explaining my own answer. And this is just one example of why it's amazing to work with Douglas. I think I was a bit thrown off by the lag, but hopefully we can adapt to that. So thanks for that question, Paige. I think I want to draw attention to what's been happening in the last 40 years. Because I think there's a part of me, at least, as a researcher and a reader, when I encounter some of the really bad dudes in this book from the late 19th century that feels like they're evil men intentionally doing wrong, and they feel very distant from us. And it's easy to feel like that is a foreign person to the Canada of today. And I want to focus more on this thing that Douglas was talking about, which was what's happened my entire lifetime. I'm 39 years old. For my entire lifetime, again, as Canada was starting to talk about residential schools and apologizing for them, our federal government systematically underfunded all these students on reserve as compared to provincial governments. So as Paige is asking us to think about, and as I've tried to think about, how does that happen? Are there a bunch of people in a room somewhere saying, we should discriminate against these 110,000 students on reserve, and making that choice? And I think it's not quite that's happening. It's something that's even more insidious, which is that everyone kind of goes about their business, and in the back of their mind, or not really in the back of their mind, when they look at the ledger of the spending, and if you call up these former senior officials, as I did, who were in charge in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, they all knew that what was happening was wrong, that it was blatant, that it was unfair for all these children, but they couldn't stop it. And I think what they had in their heads was, well, there's political forces that are kind of beyond our control, and it turns out that Canadians don't really, as a group, as a political body, care that much if you give less to this group of people year after year after year in budgeting. And I'm not even sure if I have the right vocabulary to think about what kind of wrong that is. It is a choice, but it's kind of like it's a negligent neglect, which is just as wrong, but somehow we let ourselves off the hook for it, and we shouldn't. And I think at the very end of this book, that's one of the things Douglas and I really want to put to people, which is that these were choices. We can choose otherwise. We must choose otherwise. And isn't it worrisome how easily that happened? And so we're trying to look for structural fixes to make sure we don't just fall into that same pattern.
One of the things I really appreciate is that within that, you setting the context and pointing out the role of the Crown as the system in all of this, is you stay very close to the stories of these two families, in particular of the stories of Maureen and Troy. And as I was reading this book, I had a range of emotions: anger, frustration, little glimmers of hope that were then snatched away by somebody's behavior. And I cried twice in this book, and I've gone back to those passages and have cried again each time I read them. And the first place is where Troy is leaving Bloodvein, and he shares this. He shares that it's time for him to go, and students are asking, "Well, you're going to come back and visit?" And he says, "Of course I am." And then he shares his regret that he hasn't. And then the second time I cried was in the afterword, hearing Maureen's story about her ongoing realization of the source of the trauma in her family, and how her heart was stinging from that realization. Those are stories that have just kept playing in my mind, and this is real stories, and so what's really sitting with me is a question around for both of you. This wasn't just abstract research. These were real stories and real people that you encountered. How was that for you?
So I'll start and I'll talk just a little bit about the harder parts, and then I'll let Stobo talk about the research. So the chapter in Bloodvein, it actually is one of my favorite chapters of the book, although it's kind of outside the scope of the book in some way. It's a complete aside. But it tells the story of one of the characters who finishes teacher's college, can't get a job, so what does he do? Takes a job at a reserve. But he doesn't leave after a year. He sticks around and becomes, a part of the community in a significant way. He befriends some elders. The kids really love him. And eventually one of the elders, one of his friends, says to him, they're out fishing one day, and he says, "Troy, what are you doing here?" And Troy says, "Well, I'm just, trying to get some experience." And the elder's just looking at him, and Troy realizes that he means, like, what am I doing with my life? And my life's not here. So Troy resolves to leave the reserve, which he does. He meets a young woman somewhere, and he manages to get a job back in his hometown. So he leaves. And he promises to go back. And says that he regrets not going back. It's an emotional time. It's an emotional spot in the book. But it also kind of explains those federal bureaucrats that we were talking about before. Like, how could they neglect, not benignly, knowing that they're causing harm? How could they do that? Well, it's like the same impulse that drives Troy to want to do the right thing. But against all the currents of everything else in his life, it's just too hard, and he doesn't do it. And that's one of the things that I think makes this book special, is that like all of the characters are not perfect. They all have faults, and they all learn. And that's one of the most important things to us, is that some of the characters who, are admitted racists turn around, and they become, they come to understand an Indigenous community, they come to have Indigenous friends, but the Indigenous characters also learn and grow as they come to understand their own history. And as, for example, as Maureen comes to understand her mother's history in residential schools, and what that means for her family and her community, how that explains her family and her community. So I'll turn it over now to Stobo a little to talk just about doing the research and actually the characters in person.
Obviously amazing about you, Paige, which is that you actually went back to read passages that touched you. I found that very moving to hear that, and that it's not a normal thing to do. So obviously you're a very special person. And thanks for those eloquent words, Douglas. I wanted to just mention that all the people in the book that, some of which Douglas was just talking about, they're using their real names. They're not just real people, they're real people who had the choice to be anonymous, and they, before publication, read the text, said, here's some things you could add to make it even better, and you can use my real name, which I think speaks to the process that this book undertook of winning their trust and involving them. I really see it as a very collaborative book. And the second thing I want to say is that, it's not like you just show up in someone's living room and they spill their guts out and share their faults and their life story. It really doesn't work like that. And in this particular case, it took years of conversations, often in person, afterwards, some over the phone, sometimes over writing, of filling in the details of a life and asking someone to trust you to weave their story into this much bigger story. And I think the reason that worked ultimately is because everyone in this book wanted to be part of this story. They wanted people in Canada to read this story. They are overjoyed that people in a really amazing church right now in Toronto are talking about it. And they want people to know what happened. And I hope that all of us, or I can speak for myself, that I see myself in some of these characters, in their attempts at goodness and in their faults. And I hope that's what is happening to readers, which is they can see themselves in these people. And I think that's because people shared honestly, and we made our best attempt to be honest in rendering their characters as part of this much bigger story.
So yeah, I want to just add a little bit to that, and that's so writing the living characters is obviously hard because they're dealing with people's real lives, but writing the dead characters' lives presents its own and unexpected. We did not expect these challenges. And one of those challenges has to do with the way that the narrative of Canadian history is so deeply embedded in all of us, like that story that you learned in grade 3 or whatever about Indians and settlers. That still, even for me, forms like a central component of how I organize knowledge. And so we were writing about this character who's a really bad man, and his name is Hader Reed. And what we have to work with mostly are his journals. And he's telling his own story, and it's this fantastic story of dog sledding across the prairies in the moonlight, and living alone and camping in the wilds and encountering Indians, and you know, when we told his story, there was something about it that was just like, I couldn't figure out what it was, but I was just pissed off. And eventually I realized that like what we had done was we had created a story that resonated with the facts of his life, but also with that central organizing story, the one that we're all still living with from grade 3. And so a lot of writing the historical part actually requires this checking of how do I, you know, am I telling a real story here, or am I telling a story that's being embellished by something that I think I learned when I was in grade 3? And there's something, you know, I think I can say like everything in the book is true. And that's actually hard to say about a lot of things these days. And not just, you know, because of fake news, but because the story of history that we've been told is really, really one-sided. And I was on the phone with someone who was fact-checking. Someone had written an article that quoted me. And in the quote, I was talking about how exasperated I was by people who believed that the doctrine of discovery had any legal effect anywhere, and how that was just completely not true. And I got into a conversation with them about how, like, so many people believe that this is true. It's this really weird phenomenon that I feel like I have to get out there and talk about these things. And the fact checker actually said, yeah, we're really reevaluating what a truth is now. Because remember, like, what's true for fact checkers, like, since the dawn of time is it written down in 2 sources? That's it. Then it's true. Right? Then you don't need a citation. That's the standard. And so the fact that we've written this bad history over and over and over again means that we're all telling ourselves the wrong stories. We're telling ourselves things that aren't true. And it's only now that, like, the current day that fact checkers are going back and looking to see, like, are those things we think about the past really true? And it turns out, for the most part, they're really not. So Valley is, there's originally 40,000 words of footnotes. It's very well researched. It's cut down to 10,000. And then it turns out, once you write a book and put it out there, like, everyone reads it, and if you get anything wrong, they tell you. So it's very well fact-checked in that sense. But it was really important to us to be able to tell the story that was both true factually and historically, and that challenged the story that we tell ourselves and have been told since we were little kids.
There's a cost to being a truth teller. When I was reading this book, and it might be because I'm a pastor, the stories were unfolding, I was concerned for both of you as authors. And so I'm curious and share only what you're comfortable sharing. What were your supports? How did you care for yourself as you were doing this work?
I think I'll let Stobo start here.
How did you care for yourself as you were doing this work?
I think I'll let Stobo start here.
How did you care for yourself as you were doing this work?
Should I start there?
Yeah.
I think I will if I'm not going to talk over anyone. I can't quite tell. But thanks for that question. I won't speak for... Should I start there?
Yeah.
I think I will if I'm not going to talk over... I won't speak for Douglas, but I think... I can't quite tell. But thanks for that question. I think the thing that comes to mind is that we really had to go, or at least I tried to give extra love for my writing partner, and to always try to remind myself that the words were hard on us for different reasons, and different words were hard on us for different reasons. And for me, at least, a lot of what I learned in this book was from trying to be attentive to what Douglas was feeling as we drafted the words, as we redrafted the words, and redrafted the words. And the truth is that some things bothered him a lot more than they bothered me. And I didn't always get that. And I'm still doing that work to try to figure out, what are the wounds that I'm not aware of and that I miss, and that's something that I'm constantly trying to learn from. And I think the last thing I'll say, and forgive me for the slow answer, is that I think it's fair to say that writing and researching the book was amazingly draining. For me, it was years of seeming like pouring my whole soul into this thing, and my battery got to basically empty. But going out and talking about the book is a slow recharging process for me, and I absolutely love getting out into the world and hearing from people and sharing their reactions. And I feel like the amount of love and joy that emanates from that process of people's engagement with the work is really filling up my heart, and I feel almost fully re-energized at this point.
I'll just say that this is a co-authored project, but this is not a project you can take on with someone casually. I mean, I've known Stobo for about 10 years. He was originally my student in law school, and we'd remained friends, and we've become very close friends. Though curiously, we almost never spend time in the same room. This book was largely written during the pandemic, and so we had a draft, and then we divided it into chapters on Google Docs, and then we took turns working on it and passing it back and forth. And like Stobo was saying, like there's times when I'm reading it and I can feel my blood start, I can feel the anxiety, but I don't always know the source of that. Like the Hader Reed story I just told you, right? Like it took a long time for us talking about that chapter for it to come out that like, oh, we're actually reimagining Canadian history in this way that we don't want to. There was a very long discussion that we had over the use of the word savage, which shows up in the historical documents, and it really bothered me. And Stobo, like at first he just did not see it. Oh, he just did not see that was an issue for me personally. And eventually, we talked about it and we agreed, like we'll use it when we need to, but we won't use it casually anymore. We're going to take the words very, very seriously. And so I think it was like caring for one another is really what let us finish this book and finish it in a good way, in a way that felt like we were both supporting one another and doing our best to take care of one another even as we were writing the book.
Thank you both for that. And the reason I wanted us to talk a little bit about that is because this work of reconciliation is about changing hearts and minds, and that is not an easy or casual process. It's deeply intentional and transformative. So if we could, let's switch gears to the reconciliation, to the road of reconciliation that you outline in this book. Walk us through that.
So thanks. So let me just start by saying that I think that a great deal of the literature dealing with Indigenous settler relations that is available today is really, really heartbreaking. Like it's just sad, and it ends sad. And to me, this is in some way, I think this is my Indigenous colleagues who can't do anything but communicate to you their pain, and they do that. That's not what we wanted to do. And so, although this is a very hard book to read in many places, it's challenging, it's emotional, you'll put it down, you'll cry. Towards the end, we start to talk about a vision of the future that is hopeful. And the more I've been thinking about it, there's a way in which, the chapter, it's actually not, there's nothing hopeful about it really, but what it does is it presents a plan or a set of ideas or organizing principles for what it would mean for us to live together. And I think the reason that comes across as hopeful is because these issues just seem so intractable, that there are no big ideas. We've been incapable of thinking about this as a big problem we can fix. Instead, we think about well, let's do the potable water thing. Let's get clean water to those reserves, and then we go that's going to cost $8 billion, and we stumble. So we wanted to offer, So another thing that I think is really important that we try and do is I think we Indigenous activists and scholars have for years made claims about justice that are right, that are just on any account. But what we have not done is we have not acknowledged that is going to impose a cost on others. Right? It just really actually is. And so let's just say it out loud. And then let's try and find a way of dealing with that to make it less scary for people. So that's what we do towards the end of the book. We are honest about costs and also ways to ameliorate those costs. And we do this by relying on simple principles that we already do in Canada. There's nothing new here. These are all familiar tools. So one of the things we talk about is this idea that's in the Canadian Constitution, and it's a principle of equalization. And so what that says is that the federal government is committed to ensuring that all of the provinces and territories have a similar level of basic services. So if you're in Prince Edward Island, they don't have enough resources as a province to have a modern medical system. So the federal government transfers some of its federal money to Prince Edward Island. And some provinces that make more don't receive any funding. But this ensures that all of the provinces, more or less the same level of health care, running water, libraries, that kind of thing. And everyone benefits from this except Indians. This principle just does not extend to Indian reserves. So what we propose is, we imagine a future where, in many places in Canada, groups of First Nations living close together, where they're the majority population, sort of band together under one grouping, and that we allow those communities to have political authority over what happens there. So they would be the ones who would allow timber harvesting, for example, and enjoy the stumpage fees that are attached to this. That's how you let timber companies come, take trees, and then they pay you a royalty. In northern Ontario, that timber harvest is hundreds of millions of dollars every year. So we're talking about very large amounts of money. And we also realize that Ontario's never going to agree to this because they actually want those hundreds of millions of dollars for their own purposes. So here we say, well, this is an opportunity to use the equalization formula where Indians are now paying into the system for redistribution to the South, which to my mind is what we've been doing all along. Indians have been subsidizing the South, right? All that's going to happen now is we're actually going to write checks to do it. So what we want to talk about not is ideas around getting your land back. I don't even know what that means, to be honest. What we want to talk about is how can we share political control? How can we share jurisdiction in a way that's fair? And that proposal just relies on very simple tools that we use in our system of federalism all of the time. But it comes across as hopeful because it's somebody thinking about what the end game looks like. Like, what does it mean for us to live together side by side under a condition of equality? We all sort of want that generally, I think. What we do here is systematically talk about what that would actually mean and how we could actually go about doing that. And I think that's hopeful to people because it represents a solution that is global and not just like fixing this one thing, which even if we fix it, there's still all these other broken things. Right?
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, did you want to add anything to that?
One thing, which even if we fix it, there's still all these other broken things. Right?
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, did you want to add anything to that?
One thing, which even if we fix it,
So what was...
I think Douglas covered that perfectly. I'll pass there.
Okay. So before we start to move into questions, so start to get your pens and your pencils ready. One of the things I really did appreciate, I appreciated the whole book, and if you have not read it, please read it again, because there is so much, there's a depth to this book that is beyond anything we can capture in the short time that we have together. But one of the things I deeply appreciate is that you hold so beautifully together those three parts that we talked about at the beginning. The stories of these two communities, these two families, and the crown. And that there is movement from darkness towards light, and there is still a really long way to go. And we can fall off that trajectory very simply. I mean, I'm not even sure it's fair to characterize that we're on it. But what sits with me is the $288 million settlement to fix, to repair, to acknowledge the taking of land from Wewisi-Kapo. That is one step in the right direction. And there's a lot more to go. So on that note, are we okay to turn broader to any questions that maybe our community has here present and any that we might have on Zoom? And I have a couple questions that were sent to us a little bit earlier that I'll share. And we do have a mic available for, I think Tony's going to be our talented mic host who will walk through the room. So if you have any questions, please just raise your hands. And as Tony gets to the first one, let me share one of our questions that came in. Okay, and so one question is anyone documenting the process of reconciliation at the combined school? She says the combined school, but I would say at the high school in Wewisi-Kapo.
I'll let Stobo address that.
Good question. Yeah, good question. There is data tracking that was going on at least for the first 7 or 8 years, and we cite some of that in the book, and you will, hopefully we're not surprised to see, I wasn't surprised to see that as soon as you started equally funding students, the outcomes changed dramatically. The thing that happened that made it tricky is that about 5 years ago, there was another reading program that began that was sponsored by Paul Martin's foundation, so that there was this other intervention happening at the same time, which was a good thing, and presumably is also changing outcomes. So we didn't keep citing the data because the story was getting even more complex and we didn't want to claim the benefits from this other program. So I think it is fair to say that things are a lot better, but I want to finish my comment by focusing on something that Troy says near the end of the book, where he says, as the principal of the school, at first I thought, if you just give us equal funding, we're going to pay our teachers the same, our students are, pretty soon they're going to be doing the same as every other kid. Our graduation rates are going to equalize, our math scores are going to equalize, and of course, that's not what happens. There's this dramatic uptick, but there's still a gap. And that shouldn't really surprise us because there's a lot of drivers of the inequality, and the unequal funding for the schools is just one of them. And so for us really to face up with how complex it really is to unwind 150 years of policy, I think it's counsel for all of us to the effect that, this is going to be hard work. We're not going to unwind the gaps quickly. In this case, it's been about 10 years, and people have come a long way, but it's going to take a lot longer than that. So we really have to be in this for the long haul.
Thank you. Tony.
Hello? That's better? Okay. Yeah, my name is Stephen. Thank you so much for this book. This is probably one of the most impactful books I've read, perhaps in my life. I'm from Saskatchewan. I grew up right on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, about 45 minutes from Weway-Scappo. And I'm of mixed descent, so my father is of African descent, my mother is a settler Canadian of Scottish descent, and I could 100% relate to Troy. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in Saskatchewan, and I'll just briefly tell you and then I'll ask you my question. I'm not going to go on forever. But I grew up in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s in Saskatchewan, aware of the idea of racism, because I'm one of the few people of color, but quickly came to realize that it's not about color. There's something else going on with respect to Indigenous people, and couldn't put the dots together. And just sort of accepted the narrative until I read your book. And it helped me to put some things together that I couldn't grasp, and made me realize I was part of a colonial project, and I didn't realize it. My question is, we hear a lot about reconciliation, but before reconciliation has to come truth. And I didn't know truth until well into my life. How do you get truth across to the Canadian public, which requires an understanding of so much injustice historically?
Thanks so much for that. Well, I'm hoping you write a book. And everyone reads it. So it's a very interesting question about, so let me skip to the end of my answer and then I'll come back. So one of the most important things I think that the TRC Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has done is it sort of got everyone talking about the subject, right? Like, are we on the road to reconciliation? No, we're sort of like approaching the on-ramp. But our children go to school every day now, and they hear the land acknowledgement. We all hear it all the time. And I think that when we hear it, we're like, yeah. And people will come to me and they'll say like, oh, like it's just words. And that's true. But I think that our children are growing up with this completely different mindset, right? Where different kinds of solutions will be possible in the way that they're not possible today. Like when we talk about like transferring jurisdiction over big chunks of the province, like adults are like, but kids are like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't we do that, right? But think about it. So that's like the opposite of that truth about Canadian history that I talked about in the beginning, right? It's like planting that different story. Why? Because honestly, no one, very few people, are gonna read all of the injustices and understand it, right? Like that whole story. Now, we've tried to tell a coherent story that covers, I think, a lot of the injustices. But what's more important than that, I think, is to get this seed of a truth of thinking about things differently. And when people are differently oriented towards the historical narrative, where they think about the story differently, new things will be possible, and we won't have to have filled in every one of those details. Like, I think it's like, we're adults. It's incumbent upon us to read and learn this stuff, right? Is it going to fundamentally change us? Maybe not, but we have a responsibility, and it's to learn stuff by reading. And I think that next generation is being inculcated with an interior responsibility. We can make things happen. Like, we all go to the polls, we can vote, and that's part of the message that we tell in Valley, is that as a very small percentage of the population, Indigenous people are never going to see justice until we have sufficient political support from settler allies. And that's part of what we're trying to do in the book, is build that support in the ground. So the answer, I think, is it's partly like we learn as adults and we take responsibility for that learning, and we realize that that next generation is going to be open to a whole new set of options and solutions and answers that this generation is just incapable of taking seriously.
Any other questions?
Yeah, my name is Michael Sheena. I really don't have any questions, but I traveled with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 4 years. I attended 2 residential schools from 1958 to 1968. I grew up in a Cree community on Treaty 9 territory along the shores of James Bay, formerly known as Rupert's Land. So reconciliation means acknowledging historical injustices, a broken relationship, and taking action to end colonialism. Truth, justice, and reconciliation dialogue is a journey of healing and acknowledging or restoring relationships with Indigenous people, a commitment to restoring relationships with Indigenous people. And the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a call to action for all Canadians. Many Indigenous residential school survivors describe the experience as an attempt to brainwash them into rejecting their traditional ways in favor of European colonialism and Christianity. And the tool of forced assimilation was used to remove Indigenous children from their parents, homes, and communities as a means to prevent from speaking their language, prevent them from speaking their language and their access to their culture, and the sustainability of their culture. If you don't know about residential schools, then look into the truth, not what you learned in school. identify any of the central schools in your community or your territory and their history. So that's what you need to do. And I think that's all I have to say. Be good.
Thank you, Michael.
I think in answer to your question about where do you find truth, I'm a history major. And people denigrate liberal arts degrees, but I've learned a lot as a result of history. And, you know, part of the history that I live with is my sister was a driver for a Sunday school caravan in northern Saskatchewan and Alberta. And I don't know whether my sister was right or wrong. She's dead now, so I can't assess whatever guilt or whatever was being taught in the Sunday school, but that's what she did. But it's a truth that I need to acknowledge and learn from that in terms of, you know, what my attitude as a settler is in terms of imposing my views on another community. The other piece of history for me is that my dad was with Parks Canada in the historic sites area. He was the secretary for the UNESCO World Heritage Committee when it got started. And the first submission by the Alberta and federal government was that the Badlands be considered as a World Heritage Site. And my father recommended against it. And the reason that he recommended against it is because there had been no consultation with the Aboriginal and Indigenous groups that inhabit the Badlands. So that recommendation did not go through. It did go through eventually because they did get the agreement. So there is a lot of, I mean, when we talk about history being written by the victors, I think there is a lot of history that we can learn and revisit and reinterpret. And that's, to me, that gives me great hope.
I'll just very briefly say that, so I'm a law professor, and most of the stuff that I teach is history. And what I have discovered, I'm not a historian, I didn't major in history, it's just, as it turns out, in thinking about the present, I started to look back at the past. And it turns out, like, literally almost everything that I thought was true about Indigenous and settler relations, like, either never happened or was made up. And the history that we have, that we all learn, is so damn boring. Like, it's boring. My son, who's about to ask a very difficult question, here, he's in grade 10, and he got his report card a few months ago. He'd, semestered, so history was one of the classes he took. And it said in the comments, Otis has completed his study of Canadian history. Right? Like, you're done. And I think most of us got that in grade 10, and we're like, okay, I don't need to know anymore. So we're left with these ghosts and vestiges of ideas and narratives that are, for the most part, largely untrue. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to actually go back and start rereading the history. It turns out the true stories of our past are recorded, but often in academic journals here and there. So it's harder to find this stuff. But there's an increasing amount of literature that's looking at the past and retelling it. Valley of the Birdtail is a version of that. There's a book called The Dawn of Everything, which is more about like human evolution, how we understand society. It's very important, but it's a retelling of all of that history. Peck and Hamlin has a book called Indigenous Continent, which is about looking at settlement, but from the Indian point of view of resistance, right? Like 250 years into European occupation, they're 60 miles from the eastern coast, right? And that's because of Indigenous actors pushing back. But that's a story we never hear about. So increasingly, I think these stories are being told, and like we're getting an interesting view of history now. I think it's been in somebody's best interest for us all to be bored about the past. But it turns out the past is an amazing, interesting, fascinating place filled with all kinds of possible ways for us to live together, examples of how we've done it in the past. And so I think as much as it's important to imagine a future, it's really important to understand the possibilities that the past present to us as well.
Oh, there we go. I'm a little embarrassed to ask my question now that you've kind of answered it in your talk right there, but I'll go ahead anyways. Now, I've completed Canadian history, but you've brought up once or twice, thing like, for example, your big example was like the doctrine of discovery and how many people, believed it to be true, whereas you have, rather strong historical evidence that it doesn't. So, to ask a simply worded question, what are we doing wrong? Because even like in your mention of the TRC, you said that like, oh, one of the things that I like about it is blah 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 blah, but that implies that there are things you didn't like it, and me or some others might think that, oh, we're on the path to reconciliation because we've started work on it, and you've brought up that you think that we are, I believe on approaching the turn off onto it. So, to put it simply, what are we doing wrong?
Wow, thanks, Otis. I'm not going to turn it over to Stobo because I'm not that cruel. So I think like some version of what I've been talking about is what we've been doing wrong. Is like we've really taken for granted the idea that we know anything about the past. Like we've just trusted others. And so I think one of the things that we can do is read history much more widely. So I'll just give you some examples of some stuff that like has never been true, but we all believe it. So Indians could never sell their land because it's sacred. Incorrect. Indians sell lots of land. Almost all the land on the eastern seaboard of the United States traces to an original indigenous willing seller. Indians got rolled all the time in treaty negotiations. Prior to 1850, largely in the 1700s in the American colonies, indigenous people had access to the common law courts. So if they did get swindled in a land deal, they sued, and they won. The idea that Indians were, settlers got the Indians drunk, had them sign treaties, we stole their land. Incorrect. Could never have happened. That's like the structure of a treaty prior to Confederation involved days and days of deliberate negotiation in public proceedings and the exchange of indigenous diplomatic protocols, namely wampum belts for the most part. Even the British Board of Trade in the 1800s and 1700s knows that if you get a treaty document and there's no wampum attached to it, it's not a real thing. These are all fascinating things about history that for some reason or other we haven't believed, or we've been led to believe were true. But just digging into the record a little bit, you're like, oh my God, none of this stuff that I thought was true is true. So I think reorienting, because when we see that past, what we see is like, oh my God, indigenous people are active agents in their lives in the 1700s. They're going to court. They're winning land. That makes us think about the past and about indigenous people totally differently. So reorienting ourselves to the past to see Indigenous people as like living actors, agents in their lives, reorients the way we think about the future, and I think about what is possible for us to think about in the future. So to answer that, Otis, I think it's, we need to learn history, and I think the second thing we need to do is we need to realize that words really matter. So I have a beef with the TRC Commission now, and that's that they chose reconciliation, which is a noun. So if you're all wondering why it's so hard, where are we on reconciliation, why is it so hard to do it? It's because it's not a verb, right? It's like getting to potato. Thank you, Otis. So like when we chose that as a word that was going to animate everything that we think about the Indigenous settler relationship and how to change it, we chose a word that does not involve any action. It's just descriptive. Right? So it's little things like that that really, really matter. Like the way we choose to talk about things really affects their ultimate outcome. And so as much as I admire the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's important and vital work, just like that one little error has left us all going, I don't know how to do this. How do I do this? And it's not a doing thing. It's a descriptive thing, right? What I think we need to actually do, is reconcile our views of history with our present. We need to reconcile ourselves to the idea of inequality and that we can fix it. We need to reconcile ourselves to the fact that we have made choices to be unequal. I hope that's helpful, young man.
Before we go to another question in the room, I just want to check with our colleagues online. Is there anybody on Zoom who would like to ask a question?
Paige, I couldn't hear you for a minute. Are you asking me to contribute? I'd be happy to.
Why don't you do that, Andrea? I'm just waiting to hear if anybody who's on Zoom has a question. We'd love to hear from you as we wait.
Yeah, okay, so I couldn't hear you for a minute. Are you asking me to contribute? I'd be happy to. I can't hear a response, but I'd like to say something briefly. I hope I'm not interrupting anyone. I want to say that, Otis, I love your question. It's a great question. Again, I hope you ask a question every time you get to be at a presentation. And I also want to take a moment to thank all the speakers and questioners thus far. I think that one of the things that we're doing wrong is that I think many of us are forgetting that this reconciliation project, it's a team project. And I think what I mean by that is that we actually need to try to convince more people to change their minds. And from where I sit and from what I hear is that I hear a lot of people shouting and yelling, and very few people actually talking to each other and listening to each other. And one of the important things in this book, I hope that comes through, is that we're actually trying to hear the stories of people who disagree with us as authors, but also we're trying to lay out conflicting accounts and following people who, through the course of their lives, actually have to undertake this very difficult process of hearing people who have a totally different version of history in their minds, who see the world differently. And I hope I'm not understood to be saying that we just need to be moderate in what we're asking for. And really, this is a process of finding the middle between a super racist non-Indigenous person and a really woke Indigenous person. I don't think that's what I want. I think what I really want is what I try to do is to actually hear what people are saying in rural Manitoba as a way to help me convince someone in that context to perhaps change their mind. And by the way, they often change my mind, and I think we could use a lot more of that, of hearing each other and with the ultimate goal of working together to do something, because the only way we're going to change things is as a team. And if I can briefly add, there was a question, an unrelated question from Gary online, which I hope it's helpful to address here, which was, he was asking me, you know, can you talk about your experience of shame as a non-Indigenous person as you learn about Canadian history? And I'd like to say that I personally do not feel shame, but I do feel some lingering sense of responsibility. And I think that's because I'm a beneficiary of a lot of the bad stuff that happened. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the bad stuff was also happening while I was a sentient voting adult. And so I think the way I think about it is that I don't feel great moral darkness staining my soul, but I do feel some kind of responsibility to face up with what happened and to be part of this slightly better future in my time. And I think that's a modest but difficult step that I'm always trying to take.
Thank you for that. There we go. So I think we have time for about 2 more questions, and Tony is prepped and ready to go.
No. Hi, thank you. I think I'm struck by talking about history, which is nothing is linear. So to be in this time, and I think you've both talked about it, and it's in this book, the paradox of maybe waking up to what residential schools have been and still are in some ways. But we are here in this time, and I guess Cindy Blackstock would suggest that we non-Aboriginals, settlers, she didn't want us to feel guilty, but our time is now, and the patterns are repeating in different ways. I think you've described that. And so that's the piece. And how we change each other's minds and hearts will be different for so many. This book has been quite clear for many of us. For others, it might be something else. I must say, when I am talking to friends, and I say that Canada had a policy. The policy was to assimilate and get rid of the Indian. It's written there, it's policy. It stops. It sort of stops the conversation, but it brings a different realization, right? That this was a policy. And it still goes on in different ways. So it just feels like we are, and I guess possibly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would say, whatever we think reconciliation is going to take 2 generations and more. But we are in a time, right? It feels both hopeful, and that's kind of where we are. So it's more just catching the paradox. This book, each page has it, right? Where you're back in history, and then you read the news today, and it's how to bring that together. So I could ask, so how do we bring it together? But I think the book helps.
I'm going to let Stobo start.
And it's how to bring that together. So I could ask, so how do we bring it together? But I think the book helps.
I'm going to let Stobo start.
You know, I might pass, and I think you, the comment and questioner put it beautifully, and I don't have anything to add to that.
One more question, Tony. I think there's somebody. Oh, you've got someone. Okay.
Thank you both for this very important book. Marie Wilson, who was one of the commissioners with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was often fond of saying that reconciliation is not an observer sport, it's a participant sport, that we're all somehow implicated in this journey in Canada. Even if we had nothing to do with residential schools, we all have some kind of role to play. One thing that struck me in your comments early on, because this book was not written over a summer by a lake at a nice cottage. It sounds like it took a number of years, but the important message I got was the need to build trust with the communities. And it seems to me that trust is an essential ingredient in reconciliation. The one question I've been thinking about since I read the book is, have either or both of you ever had the opportunity to go back to Wew'suwet'en and Rossburn after the book was published?
So I'm going to leave that with Stobo.
Thanks for that question. I'm very sad to say that Douglas was exposed to COVID right before we were headed to Weiwei and Rossburn, so unfortunately it was just me on that particular trip. But you might imagine that that was a very apprehensive moment for me, and certainly for the book and Douglas and I. And you know, you can do all the work you possibly can, but there's no way to know how people will react to the book. And I'm extremely happy to say that in both places, the book has been extremely well received. And a couple months ago, the band council of Wew'suwet'en actually ordered a bunch of copies, and I think per capita, there's been more book sales in Weiwei and in Rossburn than any other place. But I'd like to briefly relate that, of course, the people in the book were the most apprehensive at all, because their neighbors are reading about their lives. And Maureen has told me that still to this day, people are often coming up to her to say, thank you very much for doing this. And then they ask, can I give you a hug? You've been so brave, and your mother, Linda, has been so brave. And that's the best feeling as an author, to have the feeling that the people that you wrote about feel respected in the process and as the book comes out. And we also heard from elected leaders in both places that the book has created a bridge between the communities. And I first started seeing inklings of that back in September during that first visit, when people showed up to the book events from both communities. And I hope that that continues. And I do know that Douglas and I are still getting lots of emails from everywhere, but in part from these communities. And people, the book has created a space for people to share their own stories, not just with us, but also with their families, and hopefully beyond that. And I'll conclude by saying that we got a message from someone living on a farm near Rossburn who wrote to us to say, I think Rossburn will never be the same again after this book. And that they meant in a good way, that the book is actually forcing people to have these conversations that are so easy not to have, even when there's a community just down the road. So I think we did it the right way, and we would definitely have known had we not, and the book would have imploded 9 months ago when it came out. And I think there is a quite beautiful process underway beyond the book, and it was just sparked by some of the conversations that came from the book when it came out.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think
Do you have time for one more?
to bring this part to a conclusion, I think it was not just done in a right way, it was done a beautifully way and a very courageous way. The courage of everyone to share their stories in their own voice, and the courage of Andrew and Douglas to do the work, to be able to bring the truth and the stories to all of us, requires a depth of spirit and courage that I find truly remarkable. And I thank you both very much for that. Yes, please. And so now we have some words of gratitude.
I'm here to thank Andrew. Andrew, I have two of you, and Douglas, and of course Paige, who did a brilliant job. I think we'll keep her. Yes, 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 yes. This, I'd like to just make some comments on the questions. As far as education goes, just happens that this week was a slow week for me because of an operation. So I watched two things on television. One is called Little Bird, and it's on Crave, and 3 episodes have already dropped and will continue to drop. It's also on Lumi, where there will be 4 episodes will have dropped. On Gem, there is one of the most amazing films, gentle and so powerful, called Pour Toi, Flora, Dear Flora. And it's on CBC Gem. And it's brilliant. I highly recommend it. Of course, if you can get people to watch APTN instead of SCNN or Fox, that would be really good. With respect to Michael's comments, thank you. Michael is a counselor for the Indigenous Solidarity Working Group here at Redeemer and has been for 10 years, and we are ever grateful for his support and knowledge and wisdom. The Circles of Reconciliation is a group where there are circles of Indigenous and settler people who get together for a period of weeks. Please Google it, circlesofreconciliation.ca, and Michael is very active with that organization. And now, of course, I can't remember, oh yeah, I can't read my writing. There's a course at the University of Alberta, free, run by Coursera, and it's to do with Indigenous knowledge. And you get a picture of history plus the culture. If you want books, there are so many books. Check out CBC Indigenous Books, follow it on Facebook, check it out online. Otis, how about we use the word reconciliation? No more reconciliation, reconciliation. Douglas and Andrew, again, I thank you. Douglas, because you're here. Andrew, it's breakable. You can't have one. Douglas will share it with you. Here is a mug made by one of our priests. A mug made by our priests at Redeemer.
You broke a mug this morning, man.
Well, you did. Well, you may use it, as long as it's not coffee, Otis. I thank you all very much, and I ask you to walk away and talk away. Lastly, I hope Mark Miller and all all of Trudeau's kids get a copy.
So thank you, and round of applause again for our two fantastic authors. Yeah. And there are books available at the back. If you don't have your copy, get one, please. And I'm sure signatures are possible at the back. And there's going to be food and beverages, some little things in case you're hungry. So please, chat, converse. Let's become the allies that we're being called to be in this book.
Thank you, everyone. It was an honor to be with you, and I wish everyone a wonderful day. See you, Douglas. Thank you, everyone. It was an honor to be.